X. Ma'am, I don't have anyone left to call. My daughter's wedding is in Hartley Cove in 4 hours, and I made a promise to a dead man that I would be there. X. Nadia Osei, 28, looked at the eviction notice on the door of her grandfather's woodshop. 30 days left. She looked at the old man standing in the rain. Then she rolled up her sleeves. X. You came to the right place, sir. Let's get you there. X. 3 days later, 47 veterans would pull into Hartley Cove, Nova Scotia, in a convoy nobody in that small harbor town had ever seen. But first, let me take you back to where this all started. X. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of October that reminds you Nova Scotia doesn't owe you warmth. The wind was coming off the Atlantic sideways, bending the spruce trees at the edge of town, carrying with it the smell of low tide and cold rain. Hartley Cove was a fishing town of just under 2,000 people, 2 churches, 1 post office, and 1 woodshop on the far end of Mercer Road that had been breathing its last breath for 14 months. X. The sign above the door read Osei & Son Fine Woodwork, Est, 1979. Nadia's grandfather, Kwam Osei, had painted that sign himself the year he arrived from Accra with $40 and a set of chisels wrapped in cloth. The paint was salt-cracked now. The wood underneath had gone soft at the corners. X. Nadia had set her alarm for 5:15 a.m. She always did. Old habit from 6 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 of them with the Joint Task Force 2, the ones whose names you don't read in newspapers. She pulled on her grandfather's old canvas jacket, the one with the split seam he refused to let her repair, and walked through the dark house to the kitchen. Papa Kwam was already up, which meant he hadn't slept. X. He was sitting at the table with his hands around a mug, staring at the letter the bank had sent last Thursday. X. He didn't say anything when she sat down across from him. X. She didn't say anything either. They had learned, the 2 of them, how to be quiet together in the worst kinds of mornings. When her mother died, 14 years ago. When her brother Kofi left for Vancouver and didn't come back. When the chain hardware store opened in Bridgewater and took away everything that wasn't nailed down. Papa Kwame finally looked up. His eyes were steady, the way old men's eyes go when they've decided to stop flinching. I'm not angry, he said. I want you to know that. I know, Papa. I'm just tired. She put her hand over his. He was 81. His hands were still the most capable hands she had ever known, but they shook now when he reached for his coffee in the mornings, and she pretended not to notice. He always pretended not to notice her pretending. By 7, she was in the shop, running the sander over a dining table a family in Lunenburg had commissioned 8 months ago. The work calmed her, the way it always had. She had come back to Hartley Cove 18 months ago, just after her release from service. She hadn't told Papa Kwame about the discharge at first. She said she'd chosen to come home. He'd looked at her the way he always looked at half-truths, with patience, without pressing. She had needed somewhere to be useful. The shop had given her that. But the commissions had dried up. People drove to IKEA now. People ordered furniture from websites she'd never heard of. 3 loyal customers had held them through the spring. By September, it was just the Lunenburg table and a prayer. Her best friend Daphne called every Sunday from Toronto, always starting the same way. Nads, just come here. There's work here. Next month, Daph. You said that in April. I know. The call usually ended there, because what Daphne didn't understand, what no one outside Hartley Cove seemed to understand, was that Nadia couldn't leave Papa Kwame alone in that shop with the eviction notice and the shaking hands and the mug he set down in the same spot every morning for 45 years. She wasn't going anywhere until the shop was safe, even if it meant losing the future she'd quietly been building in her own head. A small business, a workshop for veterans, something of her own, all of it on hold. That Tuesday afternoon, the radio in the shop bay said a nor'easter was tracking up the coast. Heavy rain by 4, possible gusts to 80 kilometers, bridge closures likely on the 103. Nadia barely registered it. She'd worked through worse. At 3:47 in the afternoon, she heard it. A knock at the bay door, not a customer knock, not the tentative tap of someone unsure they had the right place. 3 slow, heavy knocks, the kind a man makes when he doesn't have the energy for more. She slid the bay door back and found an old man in a soaked field coat, standing beside a 1968 Walnut Ridge hand-built cabinet on a flatbed trailer. The cabinet was the most beautiful piece of furniture Nadia had seen outside of a museum. It was also falling apart. One leg had sheared through at the mortise joint. The back panel was delaminating in the rain. One of the hand-carved drawer faces had cracked clean across. The man holding the trailer tongue was maybe 75, broad through the shoulders the way men are when they've worked with their hands their whole lives. His face was weathered and wet. His eyes had the particular look of someone who has not slept in 2 days and is running on a promise. "My name is Frank Delaney," he said. "My daughter is getting married on Saturday in this town. Her grandmother made this cabinet 40 years ago. Her grandmother passed last spring. My daughter asked if we could bring it, set it at the head table. Sentimental thing. We hit a bad patch of highway outside of Truro and the trailer bounced." He looked at the cabinet. His jaw worked. "I need this fixed. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to hold for 4 more days." Nadia stepped out into the rain and crouched down to look at the leg joint. She ran her thumb along the break. She checked the back panel, the drawer face. She stood up. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "I'm going to be straight with you." He nodded once. "The mortise is a compound break. The back panel needs full reglue and clamping, and that drawer face is book-matched walnut from 40 years ago. I can match it, but not exactly." "How long?" 2 days minimum if the glue set's right, maybe 3. His shoulders dropped just slightly. He turned and looked at the cabinet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone quieter. "This was the piece Helene built the first year we were married. She made it from wood she'd milled herself, up in the Annapolis Valley. She died in April. I told my daughter, Cecile, I told her we would find a way. I made her a promise." The rain on the corrugated roof was getting louder. Nadia looked at the cabinet. She looked at the man. She looked back at the cabinet. "Bring it inside, Mr. Delaney. I'll start tonight." Frank Delaney covered his mouth with one hand. He stood that way for a moment. Then he nodded. Behind Nadia, through the window into the house, Papa Kwame was watching. The next 2 days were the closest Nadia had felt to herself in a long time. She worked the way her grandfather had taught her, slow, deliberate, no shortcuts where shortcuts would show. She cleaned the old glue off the mortise faces with a card scraper, not sandpaper, because sandpaper rounds edges that need to stay sharp. She cut new walnut to match the drawer face, not from the shop stock. She drove 40 minutes to a specialty lumber yard in Bridgewater that kept reclaimed hardwood, and she found a piece of old-growth black walnut that had been air-drying for 12 years, color deep enough to pass. Papa Kwame came and stood in the doorway that first evening. He watched her work without saying anything. After a while, he put his apron on. He didn't ask. He picked up the back panel, looked at it, and started cleaning the second glue line. They worked in silence for 2 hours. This was how they had always been together, side by side, not needing to say much. Frank Delaney came back in the morning. He stood in the shop and watched with his hat in his hands, the same way. He talked quietly about Helene. She was from Newfoundland originally. She'd learned woodworking from her father, who had learned from his. She was, Frank said, the most precise person he had ever known. Level in everything. She couldn't pass a picture on a wall without straightening it. Papa Kwame from across the shop said my wife was the same. The 2 old men looked at each other across the cabinet. On Thursday evening, around 10, while Nadia was doing the final dry fit on the drawer face, Frank reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. He put $500 in cash on the workbench, beside her tools. "I know it's not enough for what you're doing," he said, "but it's what I have with me." Nadia looked at the money. She looked at it for a long time. $500 was 2 months of electricity. It was groceries for Papa Kwame through December. It was a door, and this man was holding it open. She picked up the bills and folded them and held them out to Frank Delaney. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "Papa Kwame and I have a rule in this shop. If we ask what something is worth before we know the person it's for, we've already done it wrong." She set the cash back down beside his hand. "The wood your wife chose for this piece is from a tree that was already 60 years old when she milled it. The joint she cut is a wedged-through tenon, which means she could have used a simpler method and didn't. She was showing off a little. For someone who loved her. That's what we're restoring. Not furniture." Frank Delaney pressed his lips together. He looked at the cabinet. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Helene at her workbench, maybe 30 years ago, running a hand plane down a long board, sawdust in her hair, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. X. He set the photograph beside the cash. X. She would have liked you, he said. Both of you. X. He left the money on the bench, and Nadia left it there, and neither of them said another word about it. X. Here's the thing I want you to sit with for a second. Nadia Osei has a service record she doesn't talk about. She has a discharge she carries quietly. She has a grandfather with shaking hands and a 30-day notice on the door of the only thing left of his life's work. And she just turned down $500 because it wasn't the right kind of money. X. That's who she is. Keep that in your head, because what happens next, that's where this story actually starts. X. The cabinet was done by Friday evening. The drawer face matched in color and grain to a degree that made Papa Kwame stop and look twice when he came to check. He put on his reading glasses and leaned in close, and then stood back and looked again. X. He nodded once, which from Kwame Osei was the highest possible praise. X. Nadia called Frank Delaney. He came with his son in a borrowed pickup, and they loaded the cabinet with moving blankets and tie-down straps, and they drove it carefully to the community hall where Cecile Delaney was marrying a man named Garrett Tully the following afternoon. X. Frank paused at the door of the shop before he left. He shook Papa Kwame's hand, both hands, the way they do when something real has passed between people. He looked at Nadia. X. I'll be in touch, he said. X. Nadia nodded politely. People said things like that. X. She didn't think about it again. X. She should have thought about it. X. For 3 days after the wedding, the shop was quiet. Nadia refinished a rocking chair. Papa Kwame worked on a set of drawer pulls. The eviction clock ran, 27 days. X. On Monday night, just after 9, she found something on the workbench she hadn't put there. A folded piece of paper tucked under the handle of her marking gauge. She unfolded it. A note in Frank Delaney's handwriting, careful and measured. A name, a phone number, and 2 lines below it. X. Call this number, say your grandfather's name, then wait. X. She turned the paper over, nothing else. X. She looked up the name on her phone. X. Her hands went still. X. Nadia took the paper to the kitchen table and set it down. She stared at it. She went to bed. She lay in the dark looking at the ceiling for 2 hours. Then she got up, went back to the kitchen, and called the number. X. It picked up on the second ring, a woman's voice, efficient and warm. X. Gordon Mackay Foundation, how can I help you? X. Nadia said, my name is Nadia Osei. My grandfather's name is Kwame Osei. I was told to say his name and wait. X. There was a pause, not a confused pause, a pause that had been expected. X. Ms. Osei, the woman said, we've been hoping you'd call. Could you give us until Thursday morning? X. Nadia said, yes. She hung up the phone. She went back to bed. She did not sleep at all. X. Thursday morning, 7:04 a.m. X. Nadia was in the shop when she heard the convoy. She heard it before she saw it, the same way you hear weather coming. A low, building sound from up the road, rubber on wet asphalt, engines in formation. She went to the bay door and looked north up Mercer Road. X. They were coming from the direction of the highway. Pickup trucks mostly, a few panel vans. 2 military green cargo vehicles with civilian plates. Some had tool racks. Some had lumber strapped to the roof. At the front was Frank Delaney's truck. X. 47 of them total. They filled the road. X. They pulled into the yard in an orderly line and parked with practiced efficiency, the kind of parking that only happens when everyone has been briefed in advance. Engines off, all at once. Doors open. Boots on gravel. X. Papa Kwame had come to the kitchen window. He had his mug in both hands and he was very still. X. Nadia walked to the yard. Frank Delaney was walking toward her. Beside him was a tall woman in her early 60s, silver hair, straight posture, the bearing of someone who had been in charge of things for a long time and was comfortable with it. She extended her hand. X. My name is Patricia Gordon Mackay, she said. People call me Pat. I run the Gordon Mackay Veterans Trades Foundation, and I knew your grandfather's name before you called me, because Frank Delaney told me about him on Sunday morning at his daughter's wedding. And because of something else, something I've been carrying for a while. X. She paused. X. May I come inside? X. They sat in Nadia's kitchen, which was also the kitchen with the cracked linoleum, and the window that rattled in the wind, and the particular smell of wood shavings that had been present for 45 years. Pat Gordon Mackay sat with her hands folded on the table, and she spoke with the directness of someone who has learned that long preambles are unkind. Ms. Osei, she said, my foundation has been matching veteran tradespeople with family-owned workshops in need of skilled labor for 11 years. We have a crew of 47 outside this morning. Carpenters, finishers, electricians, 2 structural engineers. All veterans, all trained. What your grandfather built in this shop, we want to help you keep it. She laid a document on the table. A proposal. Full shop restoration, new ventilation, structural repairs to the roof, new electrical. A 3-year partnership agreement that would bring apprentices from CFB Shearwater for training rotations. A supply line through the Foundation's material network. Papa Kwame sat across the table from her and did not speak. He was reading the document slowly, the way he read everything, with his reading glasses on the end of his nose and one finger moving along the line. Pat Gordon McKay said, there is no cost to your family. The labor is the apprentice's training. The materials are Foundation funded. Your grandfather continues to own the shop, now and always. Papa Kwame looked up. His voice was even. Why? Pat was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 32 years ago, I was a corporal in the Army, stationed at CFB Gagetown. My car blew a wheel bearing on the Trans-Canada outside of Sussex, New Brunswick. It was February. It was -28. 3 cars passed me. Papa Kwame set the document down slowly. The 4th car stopped. A man got out. He was driving back from a trade show in Moncton. He had a full toolbox. He changed the bearing himself on the side of the highway in -28 and wouldn't take a cent. The kitchen was very quiet. He said his name was Kwame Osei from Hartley Cove. Nadia looked at her grandfather. He was looking at Pat Gordon McKay with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recognition. I tried to find him twice in the years after, Pat said. Once in 2003. Once in 2011. Both times I got close, but life moved. She cleared her throat. I was at Cecile Delaney's wedding on Saturday because Cecile's father is a Foundation board member. And he told me about the shop. He told me about the young woman who fixed the cabinet and wouldn't take the money. He told me the shop was called Osei and Son. She looked at Nadia. I knew before he finished the sentence. I knew when he said the name. Papa Kwame's eyes had gone wet. He looked away toward the window, where 47 people were standing patiently in his yard. He took off his reading glasses. He set them on the document. He said, I had forgotten about that day. It was just a woman on the side of the road. It was just the right thing. You've been doing the right thing since 1979, Pat said, and now it's ours to do. Nadia pressed her fingers against her eyes. She was not, by nature, a person who cried in kitchens. She had held it together in places that would have taken apart most people she knew. She held it together now, but it was a near thing. Papa Kwame reached across and put his hand over hers, the same thing she had done for him 10 days ago. Outside, a man in a carpenter's belt had begun very quietly to measure the overhang of the roof. Here's what happened in the months after that Thursday morning. The shop was rebuilt over 6 weeks, mostly on weekends, in the particular cheerful chaos of skilled people who know what they're doing and enjoy doing it. The structural rot in the northeast wall was worse than anyone had expected, which caused the structural engineer, a retired major named Theo, to shake his head and say that the fact the building was still standing was either good framing or stubbornness. Papa Kwame said probably both. The ventilation system went in on a Saturday in November. Nadia's old forces network turned out to include 3 people with finishing carpentry experience, who drove up from Dartmouth with their own tools and refused to leave until the job was done. Papa Kwame made jollof rice for 11 people at midnight in the kitchen, and nobody went home until past 2 in the morning. The new sign went up in December. It still said Osei and Son Fine Woodwork. The lettering was repainted by hand by a young apprentice named Bex, who had just completed her first rotation and who, it turned out, had done 2 years of sign painting before she enrolled. She matched the original letterform exactly, worked from a photograph Nadia had found in a shoebox in the back of the house, Papa Kwame's first week in Hartley Cove, 1979, his hand on the freshly painted sign, 26 years old, looking directly into the camera. The photograph was framed and hung inside the front door under glass. Frank Delaney came back in January with a photograph from the wedding. Cecile and Garrett standing with the cabinet behind them, Helene's cabinet, solid and whole, the walnut drawer face the same warm brown as the rest, the mortise joint invisible under finish. Cécile was laughing. Her hand was on the cabinet like it was a family member. Frank brought 24 Lunenburg-style ginger cookies that his daughter had sent. He stood in the restored shop and turned around slowly, taking it all in. He said, Helene would have wanted to work here. Papa Kwame said, she would have been welcome. In February, the Gordon McKay Foundation announced the first annual Helene Delaney Award for veteran artisans in Atlantic Canada, $5,000 and a 6-month shop residency. The announcement named the Osei shop as the inaugural host. In March, the bank debt was cleared. Not by the foundation, Pat had been clear that wasn't how it worked, but by commissions. 14 of them, booked in 4 months, from people who had read about the shop in a piece that ran in a Halifax newspaper and then got picked up by 2 national outlets. The headline in the Halifax paper was simple, "The Shop That Held." 3 of the commissions came from people who drove to Hartley Cove just to see the place. One was a retired teacher from Prince Edward Island who wanted a writing desk. One was a young couple from Fredericton who had read the story on a Thursday night and called Friday morning. One was a man from Toronto who said he'd been looking for a reason to come back to the Maritimes for 20 years, and this was it. The chain hardware store in Bridgewater didn't lose customers overnight. But by spring, it had lost enough that the manager drove down to Mercer Road with his own woodworking portfolio and asked if they needed anyone part-time. Papa Kwame looked at the portfolio for a long time. Then he said, "You've got good joinery. Come in Monday." Nadia left for Kingston in April for a 3-month intensive through the foundation, a program she hadn't known existed until Pat mentioned it, quietly, at the end of their kitchen meeting. Veterans Transition Training. Design certification, small business. She drove her grandfather's truck down the 104 and cried for the first hour. Then she turned the radio on. By June, her GPA in the design certification was in the top third of her cohort. An instructor asked where she had learned to read grain the way she did. She said her grandfather. He told her to bring him to the guest lecture series. She called Papa Kwame to tell him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll bring biscuits." She laughed so hard she had to pull over. Daphne called that Sunday from Toronto. Same opening as always. Nads, come here. Nadia said, "I'm good where I am, Daph. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." There was a pause. Daphne said, "Yeah, I think you might be right." The first apprentice from the CFB Shearwater rotation arrived in July, a 24-year-old from Cape Breton named Simone, who had done 3 years in the Navy and said she had never touched a hand tool in her life, but was willing to learn. Papa Kwame handed her a marking gauge on her first morning, showed her how to set the fence, and said nothing else. She watched him work for 2 hours before she asked a question. He smiled when she did. He said, "That's the right amount of time." Simone stayed the full 6 months. She came back the following year. Pat visited in September. She and Papa Kwame sat in the front of the shop in the late afternoon light, the door open, the smell of fresh shavings on the air. They didn't talk much. They were both the kind of people who were comfortable with quiet. At some point, Pat said, "You know, I never really understood why I spent so long trying to find you, after all this time." Papa Kwame was quiet. He turned a piece of scrap walnut over in his hands, looking at the grain. "I think," he said finally, "some debts don't have a right time. They just wait until you're both ready." Pat nodded slowly. "You hold them," he said, "until the person shows up again." In October, exactly 1 year after the nor'easter that brought Frank Delaney to the bay door, Nadia was alone in the shop at the end of a long day, doing the final sanding on a blanket chest. The coast smell was coming through the gap under the door. Rain on the way. There was a knock, soft, hesitant. She slid the door back. A young man, early 20s, soaked through, eyes very tired. He had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a broken chair tucked under his arm. Not a special chair, just a chair, pine. One leg snapped clean at the rung. He looked like someone who had been told 3 other places couldn't help him. He said, "I'm sorry. I know it's late. Someone at the gas station said you help people, even when." He stopped. He looked at the chair. "My grandmother gave this to me when I moved out. It's the only thing from her house I have. It's just pine. I know it's not worth anything." Nadia looked at the chair. She opened the door wider. "Come in out of that rain," she said. "My grandfather's still up. He'll put the kettle on. X. The young man's eyes went to pieces. He stepped inside. X. The repair took 11 minutes. New rung, tight joint, 2 clamps while Nadia talked him through what she was doing. He watched every step. He asked 3 good questions. X. When it was done, he reached into his pocket and held out a folded 20. X. Nadia looked at it. X. Not tonight, she said, but I want you to remember this. Someday, somebody you don't owe anything to is going to need something that you can do. And when that day comes, you do it. That's the only payment I take. X. He pressed his lips together and nodded. He picked up the chair. He stood in the doorway for a moment. X. Thank you, he said. I mean it. X. She said, go home safe. X. She locked up. On her way through the shop, she stopped in front of the framed photograph by the door. Papa Kwame in 1979, his hand on the fresh paint, 26 years old, squinting into the sun, the whole enormous future still ahead of him, and every bit of it built from his own 2 hands. X. She put her palm flat on the glass. X. Outside, the rain had started. From somewhere up Mercer Road came the sound of a single truck rolling slow, headlights on in the mist. It turned in at the gate, and a window came down. Pat Gordon McKay, on her way back from a foundation meeting in Bridgewater. X. She said, everything good. X. Nadia said, everything's good. X. Pat nodded once, raised a hand and drove on into the dark. X. 32 years ago, a young corporal froze on the side of a highway, and a man with a toolbox stopped. 12 months ago, a man in a soaked field coat brought a broken cabinet to the right bay door. 3 nights ago, a young man came in from the rain with a pine chair and his grandmother in it. X. That's how it moves, person to person, repair to repair, one small act of not walking past. X. They'll tell you that nobody stops anymore, that the world has gotten too fast and too cold for that. That a young woman with a service record and 30 days left on an eviction notice has no business turning down money she could use. X. Maybe they're right about some of it. X. But I shared this story because I needed to be reminded of something, and maybe you did too. Kindness isn't a transaction. It doesn't close. It doesn't expire. X. It just waits in the wood, patient as grain, until someone picks up the tools and keeps going. X. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And then tell me, if you were Nadia, would you have given the 20 back? I'm reading every answer. X. I keep thinking about the moment Nadia put those $500 back into Frank Delaney's hand. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. She did it quietly, like it was the only thing that made sense, and then she went back to work. X. That's the part that stays with me. X. We talk a lot about kindness like it's a feeling. Something that rises up when circumstances are right, when we're not too tired, when there's enough to spare. But what Nadia did that night wasn't a feeling. It was a decision, made by someone who had 30 days left on an eviction notice, and a grandfather with shaking hands and a future she was slowly watching close. She made it anyway. That's not sentiment. That's character. X. And character, I've come to believe, is the only thing that actually compounds over time. X. Kwame Osei stopped for a woman on a highway in February in -28 because it was the right thing to do. He didn't keep a ledger. He forgot about it, the way you forget about most of the right things you do because you do them and then you move on. 32 years later, that act was still moving. It had become Patricia Gordon McKay's life work. It had built a foundation that saved 47 veterans a path back into skilled trades. It had, eventually, saved his own shop. X. He didn't plan any of that. He just stopped on the side of a road. X. There's something in that I find genuinely clarifying. The outcomes we can't control. The quality of the action, we can. Kwame chose to stop. Nadia chose to hold the line on what the work was worth. Not the dollar amount, the real worth, the thing beneath it. A grandmother's hands in a piece of wood. A family's grief carried in furniture. You honor that or you don't. And Nadia understood that without anyone having to explain it to her. That's not something you learn from a manual. X. It's something you develop, slowly, by paying attention to what actually matters and refusing to look away when it's inconvenient. X. The other thing I notice is this. Nadia brought real skill to that repair. She drove 40 minutes to find the right wood. She matched grain and color by eye, by knowledge, by years of learning under someone who cared about doing it properly. The cabinet held because she understood exactly why it might not. That kind of competence isn't separate from integrity. It's part of it. You can't honor someone's grandmother's work with shoddy technique. X. The honesty has to go all the way down into the craft itself. X. And then there's what she did with the young man in the pine chair at the end. 11 minutes, a broken rung, nothing that would make headlines. But she was there, the door was open, and she didn't hesitate. That's the thing about building a life around showing up. After a while, showing up stops being a choice you have to make and starts being just who you are. I shared this story because I needed the reminder that what we do in the small moments, the ones with no audience and no guaranteed return, that's where the actual shape of a life gets decided. Nadia didn't save her grandfather's shop by waiting for the right opportunity. She saved it by being exactly herself, at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, in the rain, with a stranger's broken cabinet and nothing to gain. That's the whole thing right there.